That's some dangerous bedtime reading. This
I
isn't a
said,
children's book. Stick to Harry Potter. Come on. This coming Sunday, we are joined by a guest preacher here at the Riverside Church, Mark Charles, a writer and speaker, the co-author in, I think, 2019, Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. Mark, you are a dual citizen of the U.S. and the Navajo Nation. You will be joining us at Riverside this coming Sunday, the 26th. And I believe, is this your first time in the pulpit at Riverside?
yes, this will be my first time preaching at Riverside, so I'm very excited to be able to come. I love going to New York. I love engaging with the people of New York. It's a fascinating city, and so the opportunity to preach at Riverside, I'm very much looking forward to it.
Just don't, try not to think about all the people who stood in that pulpit for the past 92 years before you. There's this giant, thing above you. I always think if you say something wrong, it's going to just smash you. That's what I always get the... It hasn't
Yeah.
smashed me yet, and I say all
Okay.
sorts of things, so you'll be fine.
That's good to hear. That's very good to hear.
Okay, before we get into the sermon and the text, I mentioned your book from 2019. Is there a new book you're working on? Didn't I see a social media post that you had where you were
Yes.
in Chicago working on a new book?
Yeah, so the book I wrote 4 years ago with Sung Ra, a good friend of mine, we wrote Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. And that book has been doing really well. It lays out the doctrine of discovery. It talks a lot about the history of our nation and of the church. And in fact, I think after the sermon at Riverside, I'm going to be doing a talk back session or kind of a teaching session around some of the themes coming out of that book. The next book that I'm working on is a book that I'm very excited about, and I think the timing is going to work out really well. And this book I'm working on right now is called Decolonizing Faith. And so I'll just share with you a little bit about that, because actually the sermon I'm going to be preaching on Sunday is literally going to be the first chapter of this book.
Ooh. So we get a
And
sneak preview here of the upcoming book.
absolutely. Yeah, this sermon is the first chapter of this book as I begin to think about my faith. As you said in my introduction, I'm the son of a Navajo man and a Dutch American woman. And I am writing this book from the perspective of I am the grandson of boarding school survivors, and I am from a native nation that was literally ethnically cleansed by Abraham Lincoln, with the Long Walk and the building of the Transcontinental Railway through the territories of New Mexico and Arizona. And so writing about our coming from that context, I'm now approaching the scriptures and saying, okay, I was raised in the church. My grandparents on my Navajo side were Christians. My great-grandparents on my Navajo side were Christians. I've been a part of this faith for 50 years, and there's some things that we have to find a way to talk about. And so a story I share frequently, and this is actually going into the book as well. Almost a year ago, it was about 9 months ago, I was at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship's annual worship symposium. And I've partnered with the Worship Institute for over a decade now, almost 2 decades. And a friend of mine from Australia, he's Aboriginal, was teaching last year, and I really wanted to hear him speak. I've known him for about 20 years, Aboriginal man, doing some incredible work, not only in Australia, but around the globe, to talk about the colonization of Indigenous peoples and the justice issues around those things. And so he was sharing, and in his sharing, he talked about the history of the church in Australia and what was done to Aboriginal people, both by the government and by the church. And it's a very similar story to what we have here in North America. And at the end of his presentation, which was very gripping, he's a very good speaker, he was asked the question that all of us get asked. Almost every Indigenous Christian who's spoken publicly has been asked this question at some point, which is, why are you a Christian? Right? The church has enacted incredible atrocities against your people. How can you be a part of this faith that has done so much damage to your nation and to your people? And we all have our answers, right? I usually say, well, my grandparents became Christians in the boarding school. They worked with the church. My grandfather actually helped translate the Bible into Navajo, right? I talked about the story and kind of the legacy of of how God used some of that injustice and brought about some good. And when my friend was asked that question, his name is Ray Miniacon, his answer blew me away. He said, I'm a Christian because that's who colonized us. Had we been colonized by Muslims, I'd be a Muslim. If we were colonized by Hindu, I'd be a Hindu. If we were colonized by Buddhists, I'd be a Buddhist. He said it was the Christian faith that colonized us. And so I converted to that religion. He said, but today I am interrogating my faith because I want to understand if this faith fully acknowledges my humanity as an Aboriginal man, or does it not?
Yeah.
Again, his bluntness blew me away.
Yeah.
And I asked him later, because we were hanging out the whole weekend, and I said, Ray, why did you use the word interrogate and not examine or investigate or something else? He said, because those words are way too passive.
Yeah.
He said, I am literally putting my faith on trial.
Yep.
To find out if it accepts my full humanity as an Aboriginal man. And the thing that did for me is I realized that's exactly what I'm doing. In writing the book Unsettling Truths, I was interrogating my faith. And the book was a public and open rebuke of Western Christianity for the way it co-opted the scriptures to justify incredible injustice and violence against Native peoples. And I realized that's also what I'm doing with this next book. And the moment he shared that story, I'm like, that's my introduction. Like, that's how I'm leading into this book. Because in the book Decolonizing Faith, it's almost like a part 2 to Unsettling Truths. Again, Unsettling Truths looked at how Western Christianity and European and the United States of America, European nations and the U.S. used the scriptures of the Old Testament, right? They co-opted them, and they said Turtle Island, North America, was their promised land, and that justified ethnic cleansing and violence, genocide against Native peoples, as well as enslavement of African people. And so we critiqued very directly what Western Christianity did and what the U.S. did in regards to misusing those scriptures.
Yeah.
But we didn't critique the scriptures themselves. We didn't critique what God said in Deuteronomy, where he said to the people of Israel to go into Canaan and to kill everybody. Every man, every woman, every child, every animal, to leave alive nothing that breathes.
Yeah.
We didn't critique that. This book, Decolonizing Faith, is critiquing that.
All right, Bible, watch out. You're going to the stand next. Judge Charles is here to...
It really is. And so it's basically me coming and asking these questions that we all have about our faith.
Or need to have,
right?
if we haven't articulated or raised them in our consciousness.
If you've sat through the flannel graph of Sodom and Gomorrah, right, where the story of God decides he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he sends Abraham tries to negotiate with God. He whittles the number down to 10, assuming because he knows the size of Lot's family, so he thinks he's saved the city. The angels go in, they get to Lot's house, he invites them in. The men of the city come and say, hey, we want to have our way with these men, let them out. And Lot says to them, no, but here, take my daughters. He literally pimps out his daughters, right? The next day, God's destroying the city, and they're told to leave and not to look back.
Yeah.
And Lot's wife turns and looks back and is immediately turned into a pillar of salt. Right? So the message from that story, the unspoken message that we all get, is God is more concerned about a woman who disobediently turns around than a man who pimps out his daughters. Oh,
yeah. And I mean, it says, what does that teach young men and women about which identity is valid? Yeah.
I was reading that passage with my daughter before she went to bed. And I read those lines, and, she was in early elementary school, and I looked at her and I said, honey,
Mark, that's some dangerous bedtime reading. This
I
isn't a
said,
children's book. Stick to Harry Potter. Come on.
I said, no man, I don't care who they are, ever gets to speak to you that way.
Yeah.
Ever. Right?
Ever.
I don't care what they claim, what they say, it doesn't matter who told them, nothing. No man ever gets to talk to you that way.
Yeah.
And so anyway, right, we all know these passages are there. We just don't critique them.
Yeah.
And so this book is going to critique them.
When is this? Is there a ETA of when the book will be in my hands?
I'm
When is that coming out?
actively writing the book right now. I'm on a fairly good writing schedule, but like with Unsettling Truths, the more I write, the more I realize I have to write, and I'm trying to walk a very fine line because there is the potential that this book could cause a lot of theological debate by people who would rather debate academically and theologically than deal with what the text actually says. And so just like if you read Unsettling Truths, right, we have 2 chapters in there, chapters 9 and 10, which are the hardest chapters in the book to read, because they demonstrate very clearly that not only was Abraham Lincoln a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist, but he was one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. And we got people to wrestle with that fact, not by quoting academics and not by quoting historians, but by quoting Lincoln. And we got people to actually wrestle with what Lincoln said. And so I hear frequently chapters 9 and 10 was just a paradigm shift for people because they've never looked at Lincoln in that light. And I tell people, right, this isn't that surprising. Everybody knows Lincoln. Everybody loves Lincoln. And most people know enough about Lincoln to know they shouldn't read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Right?
Yep.
Now, they know there's something in there they don't want to know. And so
We want to keep the sanitized Lincoln. Everyone likes their sanitized saviors. We like the sanitized King, sanitized Lincoln, everyone in their nice and neat, pithy statements. But then there's the odd,
And so just like the tendency to, rather than to deal with what Lincoln actually said, to get into a theological debate about the historical analysis, and we avoided that by actually quoting Lincoln and not quoting experts on Lincoln, I want to walk the same line with this book, where I don't want people to divert attention from what the scriptures say by quoting dead white theologians from 200 years ago, right? I want them to deal with what these scriptures actually say, how we teach them as a church or not teach them, and what implications they've had. What has that resulted in our churches, the fruit we see in our churches today? And so I'm working very hard to walk that line. And this passage on Acts 10, which I'm preaching that Sunday, this is going to be the first chapter.
Well, give us a glimpse of that. My Bible calls this Peter and Cornelius. What's going on in this chapter? And then walk us through how does this make its way into the book, the sermon, all of the things that you're rolling around in your head.
So again, the danger of even this talk right now is I could so easily go in 5 minutes preach the sermon, at least a clip.
I think it'll take you more than 5 minutes to preach the sermon. If you can do it.
But so I want to avoid that. So I want to give you some of the context of what needs to happen for people to really hear what is going on in this sermon. And again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get people to look at not what they've been told the Bible says, but what the Bible actually says. And so again, most of us in the American church, we've been raised to read the Bible, to read the Gospels primarily, through a Jewish versus Samaritan lens. Okay? That's how we've been raised to read the Gospels. And when we read the Gospels through a Jewish versus Samaritan lens, so the Samaritans were people who married outside of the faith. They didn't live the according to the Old Testament law perfectly. They worshipped on the mountain instead of in Jerusalem, right? They were doing things outside the bounds of Judaism, but they were still Jewish, right? They still had Jewish heritage in them.
Jewish, right?
Yes, and so there was animosity between the Jewish community and between the Samaritan community. And of course, right, the Jews were not living a prosperous life when Jesus came. and according to their land covenant with the God of Israel, which was based on their prosperity, right? When they were obedient, they were blessed and they flourished in their lands. When they were disobedient, they were outside of their covenant and they were removed from their lands. And so there was probably a common conception that one of the reasons that the Jewish people were under Roman occupation was because of the disobedience of the Samaritans. And so there was an animosity between the two groups. And so when you read the Gospels through a Jewish versus Samaritan paradigm, Jesus is radically inclusive.
What I love is it's not just read the story of the Good Samaritan with that paradigm, but read the whole thing with that paradigm.
Yeah. Again, when you read the Gospels through the paradigm of Jew versus Samaritan, right? Jesus frequently, we're told, he goes through Samaria.
Yeah.
When he interacts with Samaritans, he heals them. He even goes back into their villages. He even makes Samaritans the heroes in one of his parables, right? He is really pressing the boundaries of what does it look like to include this demographic of people who were not well accepted within Judaism. And so Jesus looks radically inclusive. What we're going to do on Sunday is we are going to read the Gospels. We are going to look at the Gospels, not through a Jew versus Samaritan paradigm, but through a Jew versus Gentile paradigm. And when you read the Gospels through a Jew versus Gentile paradigm, you get a very different picture of Jesus. He actually really only interacts extensively with 3 Gentiles throughout the entire Gospels. And those 3 interactions, I'm not going to detail them. Again, I'll start preaching the sermon. But those
I'm trying to think, who are they? Who are they? Do I know these answers? My Bible geek trivia is failing me.
Those 3 interactions are not very inclusive.
Yeah.
And so this story that we're looking at in Acts 10 is literally the one of the first times, I'm going to say the first time, an uncircumcised Gentile is brought into the church.
Yep. This at least what we have on the record. This is the is that allowed paradigm shift? Yeah. You're breaking the rules, but I guess that's a rule that was meant to be broken. Yeah.
And so we're going to look at what is the significance of what happens in Acts 10, but we're also going to look at why do we read the Gospels through this Jew versus Samaritan paradigm? Because none of us, I shouldn't say none of us, most of us are not Samaritans, right?
Yeah.
Most of us, whether it's my Navajo parents, my Navajo grandparents, or my Dutch grandparents, they're both Gentiles just as much as the other, right? Most of us are Gentiles. And so it would make sense that as we approach these scriptures as Gentiles, we should read them from the framework of the context we're coming from.
Yeah.
And we don't do that.
Nope.
And the reason we don't do that is because it challenges our written theologies.
Yeah. Well, this sounds like a fun sermon already. I mean, if anything, this sort of let's go to the eye doctor and get a new prescription. That I think is what we need more of. To see these things in this way.
So this sermon. So one of the things I was the pastor of a church in Denver. This was 20 years ago, and so I've been in a situation where I preached every Sunday, and one of my rules for preaching is I never study a passage for the purpose of preaching it. I preach passages I've previously studied and have tried to incorporate into my life, successfully and unsuccessfully. And I tell people, if I can't use myself as both are either a positive and or negative participant in my own sermon, I have no reason preaching it, right? I should not be preaching it if I haven't tried to live this out, either successfully or unsuccessfully. And so I never study the scriptures for the purpose of preaching them. I do study the scriptures, but not in prep for a sermon. I preached on sermons I've studied previously and have tried to incorporate into my life. And so literally when I first started wrestling with this passage, it was the summer of 2020. It took me 9 months until I could even begin to talk about it publicly with some sense of like making some kind of sense.
Yeah.
And it took over a year of wrestling with it until I felt like, okay, I can actually start preaching this a little bit.
Well, and now you're turning it into a first chapter of a book, so it's
And
going
now
all over the place.
It's the first chapter of my book. And so, yeah, so this, I will say, what I lay out in this sermon, the thing that will strike people the hardest is the way it's going to switch the paradigm.
Okay.
And will hopefully open up your eyes to read the scriptures through a whole new way. And I'll be honest with you, it fundamentally impacted and even changed my relationship with Jesus. Like in some very, very, very deep ways. And I will talk about that some in the sermon.
Wow.
And
no pressure, Mark, but we just recorded you saying that. So people are like, okay, bring it on, preacher. And I fully trust that you will bring it on. This is going to be that like, wait, what kind of a Sunday moment. This is going to be great.
That's what so again, I since I started preaching it, and every time I get asked to preach at a church, right, I always lay out 1 or 2 passages that I could preach on, or I see where they're at with their things. At 99% of the churches I preach at, we at least talk about this sermon as a possibility to preach. And I would guess 90% of those churches ask me to preach on this passage.
Okay.
Now, if I were to tell you the conclusion of this sermon right now in 2 or 3 sentences, you would call me a heretic.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know if I would, but you know.
I would be called a heretic. But once I walk you through the passages, and again, we look at what the scriptures actually say as compared to what we've been told they say, people will be like, you're not such a heretic after all, but I'm no longer positive. I feel like they'll say, I feel like I've lost a bit of confidence in what I've been told, but haven't actually read.
Well, Riverside is a unique place where those who are often called heretics are welcomed to the congregation and even into the pulpit. So there is a good space that you will be welcomed into. And we also love to interrogate the scripture, interrogate our faith, have those moments to have a radical paradigm shift. And I just want to say, too, I mean, this is very much intentional, I know, that a text, Acts 10, where Peter goes through a paradigm shift of he's like, wait, what? It's fitting then that in a sermon of that, we as those who are experiencing your sermon might have a similar Peter kind of paradigm experience.
And that's my goal. My goal is to bring people through the same paradigm shift that Peter went through.
Yeah.
But to do that, I have to help people understand how they are incorrectly looking at the scriptures prior to that. So anyway, that's right. That's the task ahead for Sunday morning, but I'm very much looking forward to the dialogue and to the mini conversations that will happen afterwards.
It's good, which let me just point that out again for everyone, make sure you caught that. So yeah, Mark, you will be preaching in the pulpit Sunday. That happens, worship starts at 11 a.m., so join us in person, online. Anyone in the world can enjoy that, whether you're in Upper West Side, West Harlem, or if you just go to our website, trcnyc.org. All that's live streamed and available. And then the kind of talk back lecture, lunch and learn thing, that's happening in the afternoon, again, in the building, and also live stream. So everyone can participate and experience that goodness as well. So come for the whole day and, have that paradigm shifted. It's going to be a lot of fun.
And I believe I'm going to have some of my books with me. If people want to get a signed copy of Unsettling Truths, and I can actually give some information on how they can follow my journey as I'm writing Decolonizing Faith.
Oh, amazing. Amazing. Well, Mark, I am even more excited about this sermon now that we've had this conversation. I'm sure many others are as well. And this is going to be just another fantastic Sunday at Riverside. And I'm so grateful that you will be bringing all of this goodness to make it as incredible as it's going to be. thanks for this conversation. Thanks everyone watching, listening. Leave a question, comment, and all the places you can do that. And we will pick up more sermon prep conversations next week, and we'll talk with you all then. Bye, everyone.